we are now at the agreed time. We're at 3:49, which is 10 minutes after the last vote was called in the chamber. So if you could take your places, I'll call the meeting to order in a moment. The clerk has advised me we do have a quorum, and we are 10 minutes plus past the recording of the last vote in the chamber. So with that, I will call this meeting to order. Welcome to meeting number 115 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Human Resources, Skills, Social Development, and the Status of Persons with Disabilities. Before I begin, I want to remind those in the room to avoid feedback. Please place your earpiece in the approved location on the table in front of you. And please refrain from touching the mic while it is active, while you're speaking, to prevent hearing damage to the interpreters.
Point of order, Mr. Chair. There's English translation happening on the English channel.
Oh, I'm not getting that. Okay, is it still still good?
That's better. Thank you.
Good. Thank you, Ms. Gray. Today's meeting has taken place in a hybrid format. Members are appearing in person in the committee room and joining us virtually on the screen. I would like to make a few comments before we begin. Please direct all questions or comments through the chair, and please wait until I recognize you until you begin speaking. You have the choice to speak in the official language of your choice. In the room, interpretation is available using the microphone in front of you. Choose the language there. Those appearing virtually, click on the globe icon on the bottom of your surface and choose the official language of your choice. If there is an interruption in translation, please get my attention. You can use the raised hand symbol, or in the room, get my attention. We'll suspend while it is being corrected. This meeting is taking place pursuant to Standing Order 1082 and the motion adopted by the committee on Monday, February 14, 2024. The committee is commencing a study of federal housing investments. Before I welcome the witness, I want to point out we were late starting. We may be interrupted again, but we do have the resources to conduct a full 2-hour meeting, which is my intention. I've had a request for the first hour to be extended to 1 hour and 15 minutes, which I have agreed to, unless there's strenuous objection from the committee. Then we will suspend while we transition to begin a review of version 1 of the volunteerism report. So today we have with us Kevin Lee, Chief Executive Officer, Canadian Home Builders Association, in the room. Welcome, Mr. Lee. Richard Lyall, President by video conference, Residential Construction Council of Ontario. And from the Royal Bank of Canada, Robert Hogue, Assistant Chief Economist. And to the witness, we were delayed because of votes in the chamber, but we will be proceeding with a full meeting. We will begin with Mr. Lee with up to 5 minutes, please, for an opening comment if you choose. Mr. Lee?
Perfect. Thank you very much. Thanks for having me and for the invitation to be here while this committee takes on the important issues around housing. As you know, I'm the CEO of the Canadian Home Builders Association, representing over 8,500 member firms across the country in home building, land development, and renovation, as well as supporting the suppliers and service providers in the residential construction sector, which represents over 1.5 million jobs and $211 billion in economic activity from coast to coast. Our members build low-rise and high-rise housing for home ownership and for rent. The motions that launched this study speak to 3 different but related parts of the housing continuum. 1, below market rate housing, often referred to as social housing or affordable housing. 2, market rate purpose-built rental. And 3, market rate home ownership. I draw your attention to these 3 different parts of the continuum because it is important to understand how they are intrinsically connected. In the current housing crisis, all 3 are under stress, which is not surprising because affordability in the market rate part of the continuum has deteriorated brutally over the past decade and a half, which in turn has put more pressure on below market rate affordable housing stock. This is important to understand because there is often a call for more funding for affordable housing, which you will no doubt hear a lot about in this study. And while that funding is important, I'm here to tell you that you'll never fix the affordable housing issue with funding alone. There are simply not enough tax dollars to go around. As past chair of the International Housing Association, I can tell you these challenges are not unique to Canada, but experts from developing countries and the IHA tell us something about their countries that applies equally to developed countries like Canada. If you don't first fix housing affordability, you can never fix your social housing problems. If you don't fix housing affordability, people can't buy homes. That puts pressure on the rental housing stock as more people are forced to rent and rent prices keep going up due to increased demand and other affordability issues. This in turn puts mounting pressure on the social housing stock as more people need housing assistance because they can't afford market rate rental units. In this scenario, no matter how many affordable units you build, the lineup will keep getting longer for more. I heard a term for a similar problem from a policeman when I was involved in studying the challenges in the Vancouver downtown east side. He said, without policy fixes, trying to deal with addiction on the streets was just like shoveling water. You help one person, then there is a new one right behind taking their place, and it's like you did nothing. We need to break that cycle in housing, and that can only come with fixing housing affordability across the board. The current issues of housing affordability have developed over the past 2 decades through policy action or inaction at all levels of government, and there's no silver bullet to fix it. We need a comprehensive approach that comes with a challenge from all angles for all levels of government. We know we need much more supply, and the numbers like building 5.8 million units over the next decade are important targets to strive for. But our industry can't build more homes if people can't afford them. While high interest rates have slowed the market down right now, and we need those rates to come down as soon as possible, it is actually the ever over-tightening of mortgage rules that has been knocking well-qualified buyers out of the market for the past 15 years. We were therefore very pleased with the move to 30-year amortizations on insured mortgages for first-time buyers in new construction. We would advise that that be extended to all insured mortgages for new construction as soon as possible. But a revision of the stress test is also critical and long overdue. High interest rates have also severely hampered purpose-built rental construction, but again, the problems began long before the rise in interest rates. The PBR business model has been broken for decades, resulting in a lack of PBR supply, which is why we had long called for and are happy to have secured the removal of the GST on purpose-built rental last fall. I would note we also need fixing of the GST threshold for the new housing construction rebate as well. Back to PBR, we need simplified access to more low-interest financing and less encumbrance on that financing on things that drive up construction costs. Energy efficiency, accessibility, and more affordable housing units are all fine, but not if they are excessive and drive up the costs of the market rate units. Which brings us to the building code. There's too much going into the building code too fast, and it is driving up house prices and reducing housing supply. We need to make some smarter choices to optimize all of our housing challenges. I'll wrap up by saying there are several other issues driving up house prices too, from development taxes to red tape to NIMBYism to labor shortages. And we are seeing the start of policy action to address these, which is good, but we need to keep going at all levels of government. I look forward to your questions, where I'm happy to expand on any and all of these issues. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Lee. Mr. Lyle, for 5 minutes, please. Mr. Lyle, you are on mute.
Apologies. Thank you. And thank you for the opportunity to be here, Chair Morrissey and the members of the Standing Committee. I just want to say first I concur with Mr. Lee's comments. I'm pleased to have this opportunity. We're in a crisis moment. It's not just a crisis of housing, it's growth management. And the data points are truly shocking when you look at them. I'm the president of the Residential Construction Council of Ontario. We're a council of builders in Canada's largest province. We know that the housing crisis is affecting many developed countries across the world, but we are one of the most afflicted, in my view, and which is ironic because we occupy one of the best pieces of land on the planet. We have unparalleled resources, land, people, and yet, we can't build affordable housing for our existing Canadians and those to come, and which is critical, especially for the next generation. So, I would urge you in your deliberations to take all of housing into consideration, not just one part of it. And there's research that supports this, because this especially affects what we're seeing now, where the first-time homebuyer is pretty much extinct. This crisis has been decades in the making, as Kevin noted. And, there were various points, where we canceled long-term investments in social housing, where there was a budget freeze by Canada Mortgage and Housing, and then we introduced the GST, and the 1990s, it was supposed to have been adjusted for inflation. It didn't happen, and I think that's coming back to bite us now. We've been warning about some of these things for some time, but that's not anything new. And some solutions are in the works now with all levels of government, which is quite positive. That's a good thing. And we certainly support the efforts by the federal government with respect to purpose-built rental housing, because that's absolutely needed. It's vital for economic development and labor mobility and so on. And but we need to do a lot more. And some of the problems we have lie in the area of excessive red tape. That's not necessarily a federal problem, but it certainly has been growing over the years. And one of the general problems that we've had is that we've had different actors at various levels of government and within governments all acting in a way that affects housing, but no one's really coordinating it from the 30,000-foot level. And something really needs to get done there. And we need to run simulations, and we need to digital twin. We need to examine better what the impact of proposed measures would be. And we're not forecasting well enough. And, and so we're still mired by outdated regulations, inefficient approvals processes, and, file management that's not really utilizing the most advanced techniques. The OECD ranked us 34th out of 35 countries in our ability to get things done. We've been calling for over a decade to modernize and digitize our approvals processes, both development and building. And that's been very, very slow. In fact, we're well behind other jurisdictions. And this can't be left to municipalities. They don't have the individual expertise. They don't have the economies of scale to deal with that. And, we frankly need common performance standards across the board, which would help. And, we did the first study with some others on how much are the taxes, fees, and levies on new housing now. And it varies across Canada, of course, but, in the Greater Toronto area, it's 31% of the cost of new housing. In British Columbia, they did their own study. It was 30%. And that is by far the highest in North America, and it's not sustainable. And it particularly hits the first-time buyer the most. We effectively tax housing like alcohol and tobacco. It's like a sin tax. It doesn't make sense. and it's too much. So we need to do things on land, crown lands, government lands. We need to deal with innovation and modular housing and mandates there, and things like building information modeling mandates are badly needed. There was a recent report I would point out to you by CanSEA, which is really interesting. It's the social value cost of the housing crisis in the GTA. It was prepared for the Toronto Real Estate Board, of all things. It was quite surprising. I commend them for that. But it equated the housing crisis with chronic illness, and it was equated with cancer, diabetes, heart disease. That's how bad it is. Because we often look at things in little silos, and we need to take a broader view and the holistic view of what the broader impact of this is. So, we need to do more. We need to work more effectively together, and that's industry as well, too, on all levels of government. I think we can do this. I think we're getting there, because I think we're hitting a wall, because as you probably know, in most parts of the country, housing starts are starting to come down. Their supply is actually falling at the worst possible time, and I think that reflects exactly sort of where we're at. And we need that broader oversight. I'm not sure how that can work. I reckon that we're one of the most decentralized countries in the world, and that's not necessarily a problem, but we have to pull together, to borrow an old rowing term, on this, and I think we can. Anyways, I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lyle. Now to Mr. Hogue from the Royal Bank of Canada. Mr. Hogue, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, and thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today. I, as an economist, have been tracking and following the housing market for many years, and specifically focusing on housing affordability, which is a report that RBC has been putting out for decades now. It goes back to the mid 80s, and the developments over the past several years have gone. I mean, really are telling that we are indeed in a crisis, which is a term I don't use very lightly. As was said before, I mean, this was in some parts of Canada decades in the making, and in fact, in the second half of the 2010s, we were talking about a crisis in the Toronto region or in the Vancouver region. I think what happens there since then is that we've had a perfect storm that occurred because of the pandemic and the policies that were put in place to get us through this, that made it unfortunately a nationwide crisis. When we look at our measures, which are specifically look at ownership affordability, the cost of ownership has increased tremendously in every single market across Canada that we study. So this is now not just kind of an isolated issue. This is pretty much a nationwide issue, and this is probably why the committee is looking at this very specifically. Now, the sources behind them, and I think both Mr. Lyle and Mr. Lee before me, really did a good job at highlighting some of the those factors. But although they're very, very complex and cutting across all levels of policy making and through the industry as well, I narrow it down to very simple terms from an economics point of view, in the sense that it's been the inability of the supply side to adjust, to respond quickly enough to demand, sharp increases in demand. And so for those of you who've had an Economics 101 course, when you have a stronger demand than supply, the adjust mechanism is prices. And this is exactly what we've seen especially during the pandemic. And when home prices nationwide in the space of 24 months increased by 50%, that's 50%. So it really put a tremendous stress on home buyers, and as Mr. D pointed out, and then it had some impacts across the entire spectrum, pushing a lot of people into the rental space, where now today the rental vacancy rate is at the lowest ever recorded by CMHC. And rent has gone up, is increasing incredibly rapidly pretty much across the board in Canada. And this puts, even for those who cannot afford to buy, put them in rental, and many renters now cannot afford market rent, puts them into social housing. So this is, and I could only agree with what has been said before me. This is, we need to tackle it as an entire system here, and not just from a punctual point of view. From a policy perspective, I am encouraged now to see that there seems to be a consensus that the focus should be on the supply. So a lot more of the focus should shift on the supply side, which was not the case until we were in this crisis, to be honest. And this is something that economists like me have been talking about for years. We need a much nimbler supply, a quicker supply response to the demand that we have. And so the shift towards like a focusing policy on the supply side, to me, is a big first step. And now I think going forward, what we need is not only the policy plans and intentions, but really delivering on those plans and intentions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hogue. We'll now begin with Mr. Aitchison for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you, gentlemen, for being here today. My first question is for Mr. Lee. Mr. Lee, the federal government has announced a number of different plans over several years, starting with a national housing strategy in 2017, and of course, most recently their latest, most ambitious plan ever. The centerpiece of that, of course, is the Housing Accelerator Fund. It's $4 billion. And that was a centerpiece of their budget a couple of weeks ago when they announced that they were going to build the 3.87 million homes. Is it helping? Is it our starts improving as a result of any of that?
I think we're early on still with that program. We'll have to ask CMHC for the data that they have. It's their program. I will say that what's interesting about that program is it targeted the right things, we would suggest, which is getting more supply online. Although the municipalities could use the funding for whatever they wanted to, essentially, within the housing spectrum, the idea was, let's address the policies, practices, procedures, approval timelines, permitting systems, all of those things to get more online and come with concrete goals, and hopefully performance measurements that get followed up on, and that the actual payment of the Housing Accelerator funds that go out will legitimately be based on real numbers, and that'll be really important moving forward.
You stated that it's not just a supply crisis, it's an affordability crisis, and a big part of the reason for that affordability crisis is, in fact, government charges and fees. Is that correct?
Correct.
Do you think it was an oversight of the government to not include local charges and fees as one of the criteria to receive that Housing Accelerator funding? So you have examples now where cities have been awarded money by the federal government, and in the next breath, they're increasing their development charges.
Yeah, there's no question that we need to target development taxes, as we refer to them, in all the different ways that they come about and are labeled. Could it have been in the Accelerator Fund? Yes, I do think that the minister has been saying, when you raise development taxes, we don't want to give you Accelerator funds. We've also called for the connection of investment in infrastructure and transportation and transit to be tied to housing outcomes, and there is talk now of that being tied to development taxes as well. So to your point of, should we be addressing local municipal taxes, which have gone up 700% over the past 20 years and are a big part of the problem? Yes.
I'll turn to Mr. Lyle next. And sticking with development charges, they've gone up over 400% in the last decade, development charges on average around the country. And so those development charges that municipalities charge, there's this understanding by some that, oh, the developers just pay that. Who pays the development charges? Who pays those fees that people have to, the developers and builders have to pay to local municipalities?
So, I think as Kevin said, it's a development tax, and it's a tax paid by consumers. It's regressive, it's not income tested, and the people that get hit the most by those taxes are the ones who can least afford housing, which is very un-Canadian, amongst other things. And they've been out of control. And I don't think it's, I'm not apportioning blame on all of these issues is really pointless at this time. We've got a systemic problem here in that we're not managing growth properly. And so when you look in, for example, in the GTA area, you've got DCs that have gone up 900% in just over a decade, which is crazy. And in fact, just this month, they've gone up again in Ontario, which when, sales cratered last year, as we know, housing starts are falling because housing is unaffordable. The first-time home buyer is extinct. We can't build new housing for the middle class. In fact, Habitat for Humanity's new client is the middle class. Who would ever have thought we'd get to that point? But that's where we are. So DCs are completely wrong-headed, and it's a function of our not managing growth properly. And other countries they don't have this problem. They are dealing with housing much more effectively than we are. They have much more affordable housing. You compare us to the United States right now. We've diverged from the United States on many, pick your data point. We're diverging from the U.S. Our productivity is dropping. Real incomes are dropping here. In the U.S. right now, rents are flat or dropping because they overbuilt rental housing, for example. Their housing market is starting to come back. Meanwhile, we are going in exactly the wrong direction, and we have to compete with them. Let's not forget that.
I'm going to stop you there. I want to get a question in for Mr. Robert Hogue as well. Mr. Hogue, would you say that that a big part of the problem here in the affordability crisis that we're seeing in housing is related to government charges and fees, and that the federal government missed an opportunity really to try to pressure municipalities to reduce those fees?
Well, I think those government charges are part of the issue. I mean, they're not the only reasons why we are where we are today. And I think our worry is that for that marginal unit you add to the housing stock, now what you're adding is something that's a higher prices that people can afford. So, you're not necessarily, unfortunately, you're not building affordable homes that are affordable in sufficient numbers just because the construction or building costs are high, and government charges are part of that equation in some parts of Canada, not everywhere.
Thank you, Mr. Aitchison. Mr. Coteau for 6 minutes.
Yeah, I'm going to share half my time with my friend at the end there. Mr. Lee, thank you for being here, and thank you to all our witnesses for joining us. The first question I wanted to ask you, removing the GST is a big part of the plan for government to move forward on the construction of apartment buildings. Do you think this is going to have a positive impact in building more apartments in the country?
Yeah, we do. As I mentioned, the business model for purpose-built rental has been broken for a long time, and the numbers just don't pencil out. And so in order to build more purpose-built rental, you have to be able to do it and not lose money, frankly. And the taxation system's been a problem and is now an opportunity thanks to the removal of the GST. Unfortunately, the high interest rates have come at the same time, and so we still need other support, like more low interest financing and that sort of thing. But it's really important we get that model for purpose-built rental working so that we can get more supply online.
And have you talked to people within the sector about how it's going to impact them and how that savings can actually be transferred to the actual renter? Has there been discussion? And if so, what kind of savings are we looking at? Like, is this going to have a positive impact on the renter at the very end?
Well, I think the most important way it's going to have an impact on the renter is actually having units to rent. We have a huge supply issue, and so right now what you see is increasing rental rates. It's costing people more because of the lack of supply. It's very expensive to build right now. I don't think you're going to be looking at what thanks to some savings on GST. All of a sudden, you're going to see plummeting rental rates. But what will happen if we get enough purpose-built rental is overall, you're not going to see those accelerating rents like we've seen because you've got much more purpose-built rental, which is exactly what we need.
This morning in the House, I was there, and there was a debate around Bill 365. It was the Leader of the Opposition's bill, which would actually essentially put a tax, the GST, back on apartment building homes. Would that have a negative impact if it does pass on the sector?
Yeah, I mean, I really do think we need all forms of purpose-built rental, not just those that are sort of in the below market rate space. We need many more.
And final question, the provinces, have you spoken to any provinces that, let's stick to Ontario. Has there been any discussion around removing their portion of the GST off of new builds?
Yeah, there has been, so hopefully
do you think that's gonna go through?
That I can't say. You'll have to ask them.
Thank you for your time. Thank you for being here. I'll turn it over to Mr. Long.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good afternoon to my colleagues, and thank you to our witnesses for coming today. Very important subject. Obviously, my riding of St. John Rothsay, the Canadian Home Builders, were just there for their conference. Thank you for that. It was wonderful. And a shout out to Brad McLaughlin, local representative there, who does a great job. So my first question, Kevin, is to you. One thing that does frustrate me looking across the House at times is, the criticism that we get from the other side on what we've done or what we haven't done. And, we look across, and whether it's, our National Home Strategy, the program, the co-investment fund, the Rapid Housing Initiative, the Housing Accelerator Plan, the fact that you could argue the jurisdiction for housing is provincial, not federal. I think we stepped in a very big, important, and meaningful way, despite the fact that the Conservatives, of course, have voted against every one of those programs. I think that, to be straight, we've made historic investments in housing, investments that the country's never seen. So what do you think the housing space would actually look like if some of these changes were enacted 15 years ago?
Well, that's a good question. If we would have had all of these actions on housing supply, especially, the new federal plan has some potential. I hope everybody keeps building on that moving forward, because they're the types of actions, the type of holistic approach that needs to occur if we're going to get more supply on board and get affordability under control. So what would have happened 15 years ago, I don't know, but I'm hoping that we're building from here going forward. Certainly, if we would have had it back at the time when the industry was talking about lack of supply at that time and development taxes and all those things, that's not new. So we're hoping that we'll keep moving forward.
Thank you for that. Mr. Lyle, we've, in my riding again at St. John Rothsay, we've had a wonderful announcement on the Housing Accelerator Plan. Granby Westfield had a great announcement on the accelerator. Question to you, Mr. Lyle, is through the Accelerator Fund, 179 agreements with communities across the country have been secured. The Accelerator Fund is there to cut red tape, get homes built faster. How important is it that we work with municipalities to cut that red tape?
Well, I think it's important for all levels of government to work with each other on this particular issue. I don't have really a comment on that. For me, it's whatever works, and for our group. And I think, we need to put things in perspective. The construction industry in Canada and the housing industry is the number one industry. Construction overall, we're talking tens of billions of dollars, $160 billion a year, half of which is pretty much residential. So, we need to put some of these measures in perspective. And the fact is, right now, by and large, the market is dysfunctional. So, you know, housing accelerator funds and encouraging municipalities to modernize and improve things is good. I think there are things that are related to standardization, which is important. Like, think of our building codes. You know, you've got this is how you have to build a building across this particular jurisdiction. We've got a national building code. In Ontario, we have a provincial building code. And they were introduced to create those standards, which are important. And I think we need the same types of standards for some of our processes, because part of what we're dealing with is systemic. Sorry. Thank you. Yeah.
Madame Chabot, pour 6 minutes.
Merci, Bob. Thank you to our witnesses. My first question is for Mr. Hogue. Thank you so much for your careful analysis, and thank you for the analysis of the budget that you have submitted. You said in your testimony, if I understood correctly, that one of the main reasons that there is a crisis in housing is there is an imbalance between supply and demand. And in market laws, I think we are aware of this principle, even if economy is not my forte. But when it comes to supply and demand, there is a part of the market. Well, we've done a lot of studies on housing, especially when we are talking about affordable and social housing. And there's a part of the out of the market is important. How do we develop projects that focus on the affordability of housing and the creation of social housing with co-ops or community groups and all of that? Do you believe that that also could contribute to the housing crisis? Yes, absolutely, is what I was saying. When we really have to increase housing in all the full spectrum and look into affordable and social housing. And like I said a little while ago, because of the pressures that exist when it comes to affordability of actual properties, that means that people have to go rent and go into social housing. And so we have to deal with this issue. And we need to increase the offer of all sorts of housing, including affordable and social housing. Thank you. However, the housing crisis, and when we're speaking about affordable and social housing specifically, this existed before even this crisis of access to property. There was a problem there that has never been fixed, in spite of what you are saying. I believe that this is an actual consequence. Anyway, now, in the 7 measures that you have outlined in order to remediate the crisis in housing, you have talked about the modification of already built housing in order to be able to respond. You've talked about the you have said that the composition of the housing should be modified. And what are you referring to exactly when you're talking about the composition of these already built housing? Well, this is what we were talking about specifically, because in the past, we were building a lot of single-family homes and condos, but now the housing mix needs to be changed, and it needs to also be rental housing as well, because we want to make sure that people have affordable housing. And that also includes social housing. Thank you. Well, we've heard a lot about, and we've heard from the Conservatives as well, from the Liberals, that there's a lot of pressure being exerted, or at least the municipalities are being singled out. In Quebec, municipalities, well, we know we have small ones, medium ones, large municipalities. And when it comes to zoning and urbanization, we know that it is the municipalities who have the responsibility for housing, at least in Quebec. Do you think that it is by penalizing them that we are actually going to reach our goals? It might be better to have a more positive approach and encourage them to reduce the obstacles to housing and to building fees and make things more affordable. What about social groups and community groups and housing cooperatives? And even the federal defense person for housing says that we have to quote unquote definancialize. We have to be able to set up projects, and there are projects that already exist. And if we create more housing that is social and affordable, we will be able to free up part of the burden that citizens have. Well, if we build more rental units, that might free up a certain number of social housing. Yes, it's a mix. So everything is in everything. But we are talking about different aspects here. But there's something that is not being answered here, which is the fact that, or not being looked at. Housing is a right. And we can even see that in your studies that for an owner might be an average in Canada, might be spending more than 60% of their salary on mortgages or rental. Yes, this is why precisely we are in a state of crisis at this time. And even middle-class people have a great deal of difficulty becoming owners. And this is why we have to tackle this problem with great urgency. Thank you very much.
Vous avez 6 minutes.
Mr. Bellous, you have 6 minutes. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank the people who are here and thank everybody for this study. And this crisis is actually affecting a great deal and a great number of people whom we represent in our various ridings. I want to ask Mr. Hogue certain questions. Now, in your recent study on affordability, you mentioned and you stressed that high interest rates had an impact on the possibility of being able to access property or even maintaining it. There are cases, of course, but we know of cases in BC where their mortgage went from $2,600 a month to $6,000 a month. Now, in your studies, could you please tell the committee with a large point of view, what is the impact that you have seen on Canadian and Quebec families on these because of these high interest rates? Well, it's the more recent phase, and that we have seen. We have seen skyrocketing properties, and during the pandemic, we know that properties had increased dramatically, and then the Bank of Canada increased the interest rates dramatically as well. So once the Bank of Canada, and I think very soon, they are going to start reducing them, I think this is going to contribute to helping to make properties a little bit less expensive, but we shouldn't be too hopeful. I think that this pressure will remain for quite a long time. Recently, the Canadian Labour Congress said that high interest rates were difficult for family, but they asked the Bank of Canada to lower them, and they feel that high interest rates might lead to higher rates of unemployment. And this is also a perfect storm, which might mean people find themselves on the street and increase the rate of homelessness. Do you see things the same way as the Canadian Labour Congress? Well, let's go back to the main mandate of the Bank of Canada, which is to keep inflation at a stable rate at around 2% on the short and medium term. So we've seen high rates of inflation. We know that prices went up very quite significantly in the last few years. And this, of course, plays into what is going on. And these are the sorts of difficulties that Canadians are living through. But we've seen the effect of we've seen that these high interest rates have lowered inflation. So there is some degree of victory. We're not there yet, but this is why we expect right now that the Bank of Canada is going to begin to lower its rate and eventually get it back to a more neutral situation, which might be several percentage points lower than where they are now. And this would allow a little bit of breathing room and a little bit of less pressure on the different households. And like you've given the example in BC, to avoid such draconian rises. You've talked about the mandate of the Bank of Canada. Is it not the responsibility of the federal government to tell them what to do? And Parliament must give also the mandate. There are several countries around the world where the mandates are more dual in nature. Our objective is a single objective, and it deals simply on the control of inflation. But in other places, they may have 2 or 3 other objectives: access to property, better jobs. And so some economists, like Diane Bellemare, and Senator Diane Bellemare has proposed this. Do you think that this is something that we could look into? That's part of a debate. We have to remember that every 5 years, the mandate of the Bank of Canada is re-examined. And I think that this is going to happen within the next couple of years, if I remember correctly. So this is definitely going to be part of the future debate. To my knowledge, I can't think of a specific country where the central bank is responsible for access to property. But we know that in the US, for instance, they do look at unemployment. But this is certainly a topic that will be discussed. Thank you very much, Mr. Hogg. And just to end, I just want to say that we had asked the governor of the Bank of Canada to come here and explain his work, and he refused to do so. We thought this was rather unfortunate at the NDP. I don't know if you have enjoyed being in the hot seat, as they say in English, but it was certainly very interesting. It would have been interesting to have the Bank of Canada people participate in this discussion. Thank you. There are no questions. That wasn't a question. That was just a comment.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses for being here. My first questions are for Mr. Hogg from RBC. Mr. Hogg, I'd like to quote some numbers from your recent RBC Housing Affordability Report, which says, as of October 2023, a household earning a median income needs to spend 63.5% of it just to cover the cost of owning an average home. Can you please confirm what that same number was in 2015?
Oh, I would have to look at what the numbers were, and it's certainly much lower than that.
Thank you. The number was 39.3%, which is lower than even the long-term average. And I'm sure you would agree that comparatively, home ownership was far more achievable in 2015.
Relative to today, that's what our statistics show.
Thank you. Your report showed in Toronto a household would need to spend 84.8% of their income to cover the costs of owning a home. And in Vancouver, you referred to a full-blown crisis where it now takes 106.4% of median household income to own a home. And actually in your chart here, it refers to 140% of household earning for a single detached home, which is where it skyrocketed in the Vancouver area. As well, we now hear that chronic homelessness is up 38%, and the federal housing advocate referred to homeless encampments as a physical manifestation of exactly how broken our housing and homelessness system is across Canada. So is this the worst housing affordability Canada has ever seen?
This is the highest level of homeownership cost as a share of household income that we've had according to our RBC affordability measure.
Thank you. My next questions are for Mr. Lyle. Mr. Lyle, CMHC states housing starts are down and will continue to be for the foreseeable future. And the Canadian Home Builders Association issued a press release on April 30th of this year stating 54% of builders expect fewer housing starts in 2024 compared to 2023, and 31% stated that they have canceled projects. Are those numbers and trends similar to what you're seeing where you are in Ontario?
Yes, and I would suggest that it's a little worse here, certainly in the GTA and the GTHA. I mean, we've got some pockets where things are a little different, like Kitchener-Waterloo, which is a tech center, and of course, you know, tech's a bit on fire right now, although we'll see what the, you know, some tax changes might do to that, but right now, yeah, we're staring into a pit. So what we're saying sort of is that when cranes come down, they're not going back up. We're seeing purpose-built rentals that were condos. So the changes to the purpose-built rental taxation situation is very helpful in terms of keeping some projects going. But we're headed down in a big way, and our subtrades pipeline are dry, right? So it's drying up.
Thank you. Claims were made in Liberal Budget 2024 that they will build 3.87 million homes by 2031, or about 550,000 homes per year. So for every day of the year for the next 7 years, that's completing 1,515 homes each day, or one home every 57 seconds. So given what builders are saying, how realistic is this?
Not a chance.
Well, that's pretty impactful. Are Canadian builders able to complete building 550,000 new housing units in 2024 or 2025, based on what you know?
No. No, we were at full production before some of this stuff happened. Now we're slowing down. We've got hundreds of framing crews sitting at home now. It's working its way through the process. So now this is Ontario. There are different parts, like Calgary is doing very well right now, but their prices are going up. So that'll probably hit a bit of a ceiling. Vancouver, well, that's another planet. And of course, Quebec Quebec is different again. They're doing some things really well up there, but they've got their own housing problems. And
one last quick question. I've just got a few seconds here. Do you believe that the Liberal promise is attainable given the measures included in the Liberal housing plan?
No. No, it's good. There's some good things for PVR, but the main part of the market is owner occupied, and that's the bulk of it. So, no.
Thank you, Ms. Gray. Right on time. Mr. Fragascatos for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you to the witnesses for being here today. On numbers, and I don't want to get buried in the numbers here because I'm sure the debate will continue on that from the Conservatives, but let's keep in mind that measures introduced by the federal government, if matched by in terms of ambition by provinces and municipalities, will get us to where we need to go. That is much more home building to address the crisis at hand. And so we can talk about the problems at hand and simply identify what those problems are, and we shouldn't sugarcoat it. This is a housing crisis, but I think if we're going to be serious, either as a committee, but more more broadly than that, as parliamentarians, we should be engaged in discussion on the policy changes that will incent a much better situation. So to Mr. Lee, and thank you not just in terms of your leadership, but the organization writ large on calling for foundational change. And I think zoning is an example of that. Zoning is fundamental to the discussion. Mr. Aitchison, when he opened things up, talked about the Housing Accelerator Fund. It is certainly the signature program of the government on this, as it should be. It's addressing a foundational problem. But he, with all due respect to him, I think has misunderstood what the HAF program is all about. This program isn't about, you look at it as he does and says, how many homes have we seen built? This is not the right way to approach it. I think the right way to understand it is the changes that it leads to at the municipal level in return for federal funding, for transit, for infrastructure, for all sorts of things, affordable housing. Cities can benefit if they make those zoning changes, as mine has in the City of London. So, Mr. Lee, what do you think about something like the Housing Accelerator Fund as incenting change on such a fundamental issue like zoning?
I do think it's really important, the approach that was taken to really attack things like zoning and permitting, that sort of thing. I will say that it's equally important because those monies were promised based on housing outcomes and housing numbers. So I think it's going to be really important that we make sure that the municipalities that were granted the funding do successfully achieve those numbers through the course of the program, as was the intent of the program. But back to is zoning change hugely important? Absolutely. Do municipalities need some help to get there? Evidently, because 2, 3, 4 years ago, municipalities were not even agreeing that supply was an issue. So I think there's been a lot of change in the conversation through a lot of work by a lot of people. That's critical, and upzoning is essential if we're going to meet our housing goals.
Thank you very much. To Mr. Hogue, if I could, same question. Sir, you've written the report, The Great Rebuild, 7 Ways to Fix Canada's Housing Shortage, which colleagues on the other side will quote from quite openly, and that's their right. I would just advise them, and again, in a very professional way, to actually read my colleague, Mr. Lawrence, is showing me. You're virtual, sir, so you can't see it. He's showing me the report. That's great. I'm sure he's looked at the section on recommendations that talks about the importance of zoning changes. You talk about easing zoning restrictions. Can you talk about the Housing Accelerator Fund and how it's important to getting that goal?
Right. I think it's one of the measures that have been put out there to really incentivize municipalities to adopt a much more efficient and quicker and less expensive ways to approve projects. And I think what's been said so far, I think it made it very clear. I think that the length of time and the expenses that are involved in putting forth new housing projects in Canada, particularly in Ontario, but in many parts of Canada as well, I mean, is a big part of the problem. So any measures such as the Housing Affordability Fund that incentivize municipalities to expedite or to speed up their processes and make them more less cumbersome, I think is definitely a step in the right direction.
I have, I think, 20 seconds left, so I won't have time to get into the discussion. But Mr. Lee, if at some point, maybe we can go offline on this as well. I'd love your thoughts on the freezing of development charges as a condition for provinces receiving federal infrastructure support. Just very quickly, what do you think of that measure? The conditionality aspect.
I think, like we said earlier, development taxes are out of control, and every measure that can help get them back under control is going to be essential moving forward.
And any party that has a serious housing plan would offer that conditionality, would you say? Yes or no?
I expect all parties will want to do something about development taxes.
Like conditionality.
Madame Chabot pour 2 minutes et 30.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Madam Chabot, and thank you very much for your presence. I have a question. You are part of the Canadian Association of Home Builders. What are the contributions that you are making when it comes to the building of affordable housing. Of course, when we mean by affordable, we know the CMHC defines as one. We have an idea of affordability. We're talking about limiting the revenues to, let's say, 30% of somebody's revenues. What would be your recommendations when it comes to public policy to make to the government, which would allow us to build more affordable housing? Thank you for your question.
In terms of, the Canadian Home Builders Association, we principally build market rate housing, and it's the job of our association and our members to make sure market rate housing is available, and we do all we can to make sure it is affordable for, middle income families. In terms of affordable social housing, our members do get engaged with that as well, typically with not-for-profit partners that are focused on this, and they'll partner in a variety of ways to help make this happen. There are certainly ways to lower costs of housing through finishes and that sort of thing, but in general, the cost to build housing is the cost to build housing, and so I would suggest that social housing, affordable housing, is a societal problem, and I think it's really important that we not expect developers to pay for that kind of thing, because developers don't pay for that. That just becomes the buyers of other houses that end up subsidizing the cost of social housing. So when we look to solutions, I think it's really important let's take the example of inclusionary zoning. Inclusionary zoning is very popular with municipalities right now, where they are going to require developers to have a certain number of units be below market rate and be affordable. Well, that can only be done if some sort of public subsidy is provided, because if it's not, then the existing units, the units that are going to be built for market rate, become more expensive because they're paying for those. So I think there's some very good public policy measures that can be taken. So, for example, providing subsidies on land, reducing development taxes, those types of things, so that we can make the cost of those affordable units less expensive. But I don't think we can require people who are trying to make a living building housing to be the one, or the people who are trying to just get into their first home, be the ones who have to subsidize social housing.
Je vote Monsieur Boulris pour 2 minutes et demie.
Merci beaucoup. Je vais retourner avec Monsieur Hogg. Monsieur Hogg, dans une réunion de comité précédent, il y avait le directeur parlementaire du budget qui était venu nous...
The parliamentary budget officer came to talk to us about an evaluation of what they called, if I remember correctly, invisible homelessness, where people, for example, are going to live in their car, or who are going to live 3 or 4 tenants together, and that's maybe not their match plan. They're forced to do it to share the cost of housing. And also, all those young people who remember Tanguy, young people who are staying home at 25, 30, 35 years, which appears to be a phenomenon that is increasing because those young people cannot afford to buy a first home. According to your study, did you observe or evaluate that phenomenon of those kids who don't leave home? We would like to do so, quite sincerely. We'd love to do a study like that. It's very difficult to know who is living at home for economic reasons and who is there for other reasons other than economic. But it's a question of data, and to my knowledge, I haven't seen those data. So often we talk about the people around the table, we talk about affordability, affordable housing, houses that people can afford to buy. In your opinion, what would be the conditions that would enable a young couple to have access to property and be able to buy a first home? We're often talking about the fact that the rent, or let's say the cost of housing, shouldn't be more than 30% of income, but that's once you've acquired it to buy a first home. And it's becoming more and more difficult. So what do you think are the solutions? Well, it's really going to vary across the country, because the problems of affordability are in different degrees depending where you are. If you're talking about Vancouver, the solutions will be for young families that want to buy a first house and get established, the bar is very high, and there's going to have to be a lot of compromise made in those choices. Whereas if we're talking about smaller municipalities, such as in other parts of the country, those young couples, maybe it's a little more realistic for them to ultimately be able to make a purchase of either a condo or a house, a single family house somewhere. So the conditions really vary a lot across the country. Thank you very much.
We had agreed to go to 1 hour 15 minutes, which would be 5:05. So we'll conclude with Mr. Lawrence for 5 minutes and then Mr. Collins, if that's agreeable. Yeah, Mr. Lawrence.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. And my colleague was indeed prescient, I should say. I want to spend a little bit of time on the Great Rebuild, 7 ways to fix Canada's housing shortage. And I will be talking about the recommendations in there as well. But we'll just set the stage here. So, I mean, the story is, as I say, as old as time. In that we have an imbalance in the market where we've had demand outstripping supply. And of course, this has led to price shocks from oil to consumer goods to now housing. So I actually just want to start it's on page 6. And you point out in a great chart here that the number of households, which has increased from 2015 to 2019, has greatly outstripped the housing stock. And in the rest of Canada, it appears as though the number for housing for number of new households is at 400,000, while the housing stock is a little under 300,000. Have I relayed that chart correctly, Mr. Hogue? Is that?
I believe so. I'm just scrambling very quickly here to find it in the print version of it.
No worries. Well, will you look that up? I'll just fill in a little bit of air here and say I think we can all agree that the problem has been over the last 9 years that the amount of demand for housing, new household formation, has dramatically outstripped the amount of houses. And then we can talk a little bit about what that has translated into. And as my colleague said, we've seen housing, the average home as percentage of median household income has gone from 39%, in other words, 4/10 of a paycheck of an average Canadian to housing, to now 6/10. So that's a rise of almost 50%. As worrying as that definitely is, I perhaps am most troubled, and I certainly have seen this in my community, where we've actually seen the rent increases go from an average in 2015 at about $20 to an unbelievable average increase of $100 in 2023. Mr. Hogue, are you as concerned as I hope all Canadians are at this dramatic increase in the rise in rent for Canadians?
This is exactly why we're talking about a housing crisis here. These home ownership costs, as well as rental costs, have gone through the roof and putting tremendous pressure on many Canadians, including all the way up to the middle class. So this is why you're having this committee, I'm assuming, right now, as well as looking for solutions across the board, across all levels of policymakers here.
From there, perhaps we'll talk a little bit about some solutions that you propose in here. One of the things that you say is that lower interest rates will help maybe a little bit, but not a lot. You do have also an excellent chart, and I'll just tell you what it is so you don't have to go searching for it, but it's on page 11, that shows the number of housing starts decline as interest rates increase. In fact, we've had testimony as well. If interest rates continue to stay high, and I will tell you that Tiff Macklin, Governor of the Bank of Canada, said that excessive government spending will lead to interest rates staying high, will that have a detrimental impact on the housing affordability?
Well, it will remove the chance of housing affordability to improve in a material way. I mean, the drop in interest rates that we're expecting over the next year and a half will help, but we'll just have like a mild, compared to what we've been. The massive deterioration that we've seen in affordability would just only restore the part of it.
And to solve the housing crisis, we've seen numbers either from the government or from the CHMC, that in between 3 to 5 million additional houses or doors over the next 10 years. Are your projections or forecasts showing that Canada will be anywhere near that over the next 10 years, if you have those projections?
We don't have, well, the projections we have, I think, would come short. I think we need to, we're construction sector to deliver the number of units that will be needed over the next several years.
So just to confirm, we've heard from multiple witnesses that the current Liberal plan will continue to have a deficit of housing supply, which will lead to continued unaffordability in the housing market. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lawrence. Now I believe we have Mr. Collins for 5 minutes.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I'll start with maybe Mr. Lee. I've had a number of conversations since last fall when we announced the GST removal on purpose-built rentals with local construction firms as well as housing advocates about the benefit that flows through to those who are trying to reduce the cost of building affordable rentals. Can you talk about what it means to those that you deal with in terms of the benefits that accrue to those in the industry?
Yeah, well, like we were saying earlier, I think that the removal of GST was an important part of just making the business model viable for purpose-built rental. We've just and more needs to be done. I mean, we do, as I said, we need lower interest on loans, and that can come through CMHC as well. We need to be better able to access those loans with less hoops to jump through. But in the absence of doing that kind of thing and removing the GST on purpose-built rental, we've seen what the market has done, which is an inability to build. And unfortunately, right now, we're seeing a big slowdown still because of the high interest rate environment and other issues, especially in the GTA. And so we're going to need some more action to get more action in terms of construction moving forward.
I asked that question because the government's being asked to remove the GST on purpose-built rentals through a private member's bill. Do you support removing it, or is it? How long do you think that that incentive should remain in place?
I'm sorry, you're saying they're being asked to retract the. Yeah, well, I think as long as you want more purpose-built rental built moving forward, you're going to need to not have GST on purpose-built rental, or you're going to have to find some other way to make the business model more viable. So the GST is part of it. As I said, low interest financing, part of it. And municipalities and provinces have ways to also reduce the costs of building construction and need to play their part as well.
Mr. Lyle, can I ask you the same? You talked about GST incentives in your opening comments. You talked about it's one of many incentives that are required to close the gap on cost and lower the cost to those who are seeking to access that product. Do you support keeping the GST waiver in place now, or do you suggest that we move on and look to other initiatives?
We need to shock the market. Right now, we're looking at, and I can tell you in our circles down in this part of the world, which is really my core base, but we're doing comparisons now to 1991, where the industry went down 85%. And so, we got to the point, and I don't want to assign blame here, and I'm not partisan, but we tax housing too much. Housing costs are too high. We can't build new housing that the middle class can afford. If that's not a problem, I don't know what it is. And then Mr. Hogue might comment on this, but when I look at housing costs relative to who we have to compete with south of the border, we're about 50% higher, apples to apples comparison. It's never been that far apart. And the data points are staggering. I mean, I was a construction worker. I paid my way through university. I had a car. I had an apartment. I was able to do all those things. Life was very good to me at that time. That's impossible today. And then I worked in government. I worked in trade, industry policy, technology policy. I was in economic development. And I've been doing this job for 30 years, and I've never seen numbers like the numbers we're looking at right now. They are frightening. And I don't mean to, this is not scaremongering stuff, but you know, it's bad. And so we've got to get our costs down. And a big part of that is we have one of the most inefficient development and building approvals processes in the world. And that's not a knock. There's some municipalities and so on, there's people working really hard at this. We have the people. And our taxes are too high. I mean, I could tell you about a comparison with Dallas, Texas.
I do have other questions. So
yeah,
if I could
sorry, I'm
just-
sorry. Yeah,
No problem.
I'm sorry.
Mr. Lee, can I ask you, you know, I think everyone mentioned it's an all-of-government approach in terms of getting us out of this housing crisis, and it's taken decades to get us to where we are today.
Yeah.
Can I ask, I find it interesting that provinces come to us oftentimes. I'll use the province of Ontario as an example. They come to us and they ask for transit resources, and when we ask them for something on the housing file, we receive little support in return. And so I can go through, as my friend and colleague Mr. Long did, and tell you all of the programs that we have to assist the industry and not-for-profit sector in terms of providing support. And then when I turn to the province of Ontario, I'm not certain anyone on this call in this meeting could name one program the province of Ontario has right now to incentivize new development. What does the federal government do when we have reluctant partners like the province of Ontario? When it comes to building either affordable housing or getting them on board for policy issues or matching funding, like we're going to ask them for our encampment fund. Do you have any suggestions in that regard? And it looks like I'm out of time. The chair is going to jump in, but if you have something to provide in writing, I'll take it.
A short answer, Mr. Lee, and that will conclude.
We need all levels of government working together. So finding that alignment and having those discussions is paramount, because if we don't, we're going to just spiral the way we are right now. So we definitely need everybody working together.
Thank you, Mr. Collins. Thank you to the witness. I had offered a last question to Madame Chabot and Monsieur Belarus, but they were okay. So with that, we will conclude the first hour and 15 minutes of today's committee business. Again, thank you to the witness for appearing and providing your testimony. It's most appreciated.
Merci
I will
beaucoup.
suspend for a few moments while we transition.
Thank you very much.
To begin the version 1 of the committee's last report. So we'll suspend for a few moments.
you.